Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the workshop Environmental Effects of Offshore Energy, International Knowledge, and the Chilean Perspective. I am Liselle Garavelli, and today I will present the workshop with my colleagues, Dr. Andrea Copping and Dr. Linnea Emery. So we are from the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, one of the United States Department of Energy's national laboratory. And the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory is the only one with a marine station. And this marine station is actually located in Sequim, Washington. And with us, we have also Dr. Sergio Navarrete from Pontificia La Puc. Next slide, please. Okay.
Yes, well, I can present you later on all the other presenters.
Okay, great. So some technical notes for Zoom just to start quickly. Please keep your video off, but consider turning it on for the breakout group. Stay muted unless you're speaking, please. And to ask a question, you can raise your hand. So this is at the bottom of your screen. And you can also ask some question, and to enter the question, you can type into the chat box. Next slide. So in the agenda today, we are talking about the international knowledge of environmental effect of offshore energy, the Chilean perspective by Sergio Navarrete. We are going to give you some instruction for the breakout session, and after the breakout session, we will report and wrap up the workshop. So Natalie, if you want to introduce everyone, please do.
Yes, so first of all, thanks for the support of OES on preparing this workshop together with the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. I would like to introduce also Andrea Copping. Andrea Copping, she also was with us in the panel in the morning. She's senior research scientist at the Pacific Northwest Laboratory from the Department of Energy of the United States. She's also involved in marine offshore wind development, environmental impacts from offshore energy installations, laboratory fields, modeling, measurements, siting, and permitting decisions. And also she's part of MERIC's International Committee. So thank you, Andrea, for being here. So we also have Liza. She already introduced herself, but also letting you know that she's a research scientist from the Coastal Science Division of the same laboratory. She's a biological oceanographer and uses monitoring and modeling tools to study the population dynamics of marine species and inform effective management and conservation. She's currently involved in projects aiming to understand environmental effects of marine energy. Thank you also, Liza. And finally, to Linnea Emery. Linnea is a benthic ecologist from the Coastal Science Division 2. Her research uses an integrative and multidisciplinary approach to study potential effects of offshore energy structures on benthic habitats. We appreciate your interest in participating today to all of your team. And finally, we will have our local expert, Sergio Navarrete. He's MERIC's project leader and also director of the Coastal Station for Marine Research, SIM, here in Chile, in Las Cruces. Sergio is a marine biologist, PhD in zoology. Sergio has advanced also knowledge of ecology, hydrography, and physical forcing in the coastal ocean, and also how this affects benthic communities through modulating productivity, dispersal, and recruitment. So I'm leaving now the floor to your team, Andrea, Liza, or Linnea. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you very much, Natalie, for having us. We really appreciate MERIC hosting this workshop, allowing OES Environmental and Pacific Northwest National Lab this opportunity to talk with colleagues here in Chile. I am Andrea Copping, and I'm going to present the the sort of status of international knowledge on environmental effects as we know them right now. Next slide, please. So why do we think about environmental effects? When people think marine energy, many of them are studying the technologies, but there's an important reason we're doing marine energy. We know we want to mitigate climate change. We want to produce reliable, local, secure energy sources. But there are still concerns among stakeholders and regulators of what might happen when we put these devices in the water. It's also clear that regulatory processes are not always well established in every country. It's not clear how to go about consenting. And the reasons that some of these concerns are still around is that we are putting new unknown technologies. We don't know what harm they might cause. We're putting them in ocean spaces where they've never been before, but there are many other users there, fisheries and recreation and navigation. And these high energy areas where we might take wind, wave, or tidal energy are parts of the ocean we don't know well. We don't have enough knowledge because we don't generally study these hard areas. In addition, some of the marine species that we worry about around these devices are already under stress from climate change, from fishing, etc. So how do we move forward with this? We have to try to simplify or shorten the times to consent and deploy devices and arrays simply so we learn more. There aren't enough in the water to study at the moment. This will allow us to decrease the scientific uncertainty, provide more confidence to stakeholders and regulators that this is responsible. And we can do this to a large extent through sharing information internationally. Next slide, please. I just want to note that OES Environmental is really the overall program running here. This is an initiative under the International Energy Agency Ocean Energy Systems. Ocean Energy Systems, or OES, is 25 countries that come together to try to progress marine energy in an environmentally responsible manner. And 16 of those countries, which are listed there, have come together to study specifically environmental effects. How do we understand them? How do we make sure the information is well shared? And how do we set research agendas for the future? Next slide, please. OES Environmental has actually been running for 11 years now. We've been through three phases. We're in phase 4. And at the end of each phase, we've written a major report. Last September 2020, we wrote the State of the Science report for 2020, which I'll talk a little bit about more later. But this is what we consider to be the best resource there is in the world at the moment on environmental effects information. Next slide. Okay, so how do we think about environmental effects? We try to use this idea of stressors and receptors, where stressors are the marine energy devices, the systems, the moorings, the cables that could cause stress or injury or death to marine animals and habitats. The receptors are those marine animals and habitats and ecosystem processes. Over these 10 years of study, we have put this down to 7 different types of stressors that might be causing harm. And that's what I'm going to focus on here today. The first is collision risk, where animals might run into a tidal turbine or an offshore wind turbine. Underwater noise might disturb animals. Electromagnetic fields that are emitted from cables, electrical cables. Changes in habitats in the benthic and the pelagic. Mooring lines, these floating devices will be moored to the bottom, and there's the possibility of interaction with large animals, changes in oceanographic systems, and finally, displacement or barrier effects. Now, I'm going to talk about all of these except displacement and barrier effects. This idea here is that with many, many devices out in the ocean, this could change the migratory patterns or the ability of animals to reach their preferred habitats. But we simply don't have that many devices out in the ocean yet, so we can't study it, we can't model it. But this is something we will be looking towards in the future. Next slide, please. Okay, I want to go through each of these stressors, the first being collision risk. And this is a concern for tidal turbines, for marine mammals, for fish, for diving seabirds. And if we have floating offshore wind, of course, there's always the concern that seabirds will fly into the rotor. We have very few observations, good observations, for any of these, particularly underwater. We do have collision risk models. They're not great, they're getting better, but none of them have been validated with field data. So we try to assess the relative risk. And you see this dial on the right, you'll see a number of these. We have used this dial to get an idea of the perceived risk. Over in the red is very high risk, the green is low risk. We consider collision risk to be quite high, up to the orange there. The stripes underneath are some ways that we can improve upon and perhaps lower that risk. More research, more modeling, more monitoring, sharing information. We consider this to be a high risk because we're uncertain what the probability of a collision occurring, an animal swimming into or flying into a blade. And we also don't know what the consequence of that collision might be. Would the animal be hurt? Would it die? Would it affect the population? So that's the status there. Next slide, please. We think about underwater noise. Now, for marine energy and floating wind, we don't generally do pile driving, the very heavy noise, which we know to be damaging to marine animals. So we're talking about operational noise, the turning of the blades, the generator, and so on. We care about this because marine animals use sound in the water to communicate and navigate. We don't think there will be physical damage. The noises are not that, the sounds are not that loud, but they could have changes in behavior that could make it difficult for them to hunt, to mate, and so on. For this assessment, we have some important tools that have only become available lately. There is an international specification under the IEC TC114. It tells us how to measure these underwater sounds from tidal turbines and wave devices. In addition, the US has regulatory thresholds for underwater sound for what's allowable for marine mammals not to do harm. And there is also guidance for fish as well. And quite a number of countries have been using them. They're the only ones that seem to exist at the moment. We have measured a number of tidal turbines and wave energy converters, and they all so far fall below these regulatory thresholds, which is good. We think floating offshore wind turbines for noise will not be much of a problem because very little of the noise from the rotor is likely to reach animals in the water. The birds are generally not bothered. So we see this as a lower risk. It's down in sort of the light green as compared to collision. Next slide, please. Okay, electromagnetic fields. We know that energized cables carrying energy to shore will give off electromagnetic fields. However, only some marine species are sensitive, actually can sense it. Those that do, we know from lab and field studies, are aware of these fields, but they don't seem to be harmful. They don't seem to change their behavior or their ability to feed and so on very much. But this is only with small numbers of devices as we have now. As we get to much larger arrays, therefore more energy in cables, maybe more electromagnetic fields, we need to watch for this. We don't have any standardized methods or thresholds to measure against, but overall, at least for small numbers of devices now, we consider this a relatively low risk, and that's why it's down in the green. Next slide, please. Changes in habitats. We worry about loss or changes in benthic habitats and also the pelagic water column. Fortunately, we can learn something from other offshore industries, oil and gas, and so on. And what we've really learned is that marine energy projects need to be carefully sited so they don't land on rare or unusual habitats. And in that case, there's not very much loss of habitat. Related to this, fish will come and shoal or reef around a device. And of course, benthic organisms will settle. We call that biofouling. Neither of these seem to cause any harm environmentally. They may be annoying for the developer to have a lot of biofouling, but it's not an environmental risk. There is a theory that there could form pathways for introductions of non-native species, but there are no studies that actually show this at this point. So we consider this a relatively low risk, hence the needle down in the green. Next slide, please. Changes in oceanographic systems. So, but just by putting devices in the water, we may change circulation, wave height, sediment transport patterns, maybe someday even changing water quality in marine food webs. But for the small numbers of devices that we have in the water now that we can look at, we cannot measure these changes. They are too small. They are less than the natural variability of the system. So we rely on computer models. And in those computer models, you can put in really large arrays to try to show some changes. But none of these computer models are validated. So at least now, for small numbers of devices, we consider this a very low risk, but we do need to get field data as we go to larger arrays. Next slide, please. Okay, encounters with moorings and cables. Floating devices will have mooring lines. They will have cables between platforms for offshore wind or for wave. And there are concerns among stakeholders coming from loose fishing gear and old cables. But this is not an appropriate concern for marine energy, simply because we do not have loose ends of lines that can wrap around, say, a whale or a shark. We do not have, and the tension on the mooring lines is too great to form a loop. So we consider this a very low stressor. It is mentioned many times with stakeholders, but we are slowly beginning to really understand what this risk is, and it appears to be very low. Next slide, please. Okay, so that was a very fast run through the various stressors. So what does this all mean? What's the bottom line? It appears that the likely risk to marine animals is very small for small numbers of marine energy or floating wind devices. The one exception may be collision risk, and we need to go on studying that one. It's difficult to do. But there's some principles we need to bring to bear here. The first is that data collection required for consenting has to be proportionate to the risk. Many developers have been asked to collect a great deal of data at great cost, sometimes risking a project that may not be warranted. But at the same time, we need sufficient evidence of risk or likely risk that regulators can rely on. And that is up to the research community to create those, to produce those data. We also need to be able to transfer data and information from already consented projects, from research studies, from analogous industries. So we don't redo every study at every project, but rather use what we've learned. And finally, we need to try to retire risks that aren't significant. That is, put them aside, not focus on those, but rather focus on the important risks. But as we get to much, much larger arrays, we will probably have to go back and revisit those risks. Okay, next slide. Okay, I just want to leave you with very quickly with some resources. If you're not familiar with them, TETHIS is our online knowledge management system, and it contains papers, reports, and a great deal more. It's got about 7,700 scientific papers that support marine and wind energy development. TETHIS Blast is our every 2 weeks newsletter. If you don't get that, please go sign up for it. I think you'd find it interesting. And there's a lot more archived webinars and so on. And the link is right there, tethis.pnnl.gov. Next slide, please. And I mentioned the OES 2020 State of the Science report. When this came out in September, it was the most up-to-date compilation of scientific research. It's over 300 pages, 40 authors and contributors, and it talked about much of what I talked about in great detail, also talked about environmental monitoring technologies, strategies for accelerating consenting, and so on. And again, you can find that on TETHIS. There's the URL. Next slide, please. In addition, if you don't want to read 300 pages, there is a standalone executive summary. There's also these short science summaries we find are very useful, say with the policy level of government, to get just a quick 2-page overview of what the issues are and so on. And again, those can be found on TETHIS. Next slide, please. What are we doing now? OES Environmental continues for another 4 years. We will continue to engage internationally and would really hope to be engaging more with our Chilean colleagues. We do run workshops and conferences, used to be in person, now online, webinars, and so on. And we are starting to look more at the Southern Hemisphere because we've been very northern centric, and also tropical areas. And eventually we'll write another State of the Science report. Next slide, please. Okay, so I want to stop here and just think a little bit about what do we need to succeed in marine energy development, at least from the environmental side. We really need a strong regulatory process in place that everyone understands. We need good observations in the oceans to know what the baseline should look like. We need to clearly communicate with our stakeholders what we are doing and bring them into the process. And in every case, we need local expertise and knowledge, as well as collaborations internationally, so we can really bring all the information to bear. And with that, next slide, please. I'd like to thank you for listening. And at this point, I want to turn it over to Sergio Navarrete to give us really what this means within the Chilean perspective.
Okay, so thank you very much for the invitation to this symposium. Andrea asked me and the people at MERIC to talk a little bit about the studies that could have been conducted on environmental impact of any offshore energy devices in Chile. But since there is no project conducted in Chile and very little to no research on environmental impact assessment of these devices, that would make for a very brief presentation. So I thought I would share with you some thoughts regarding which are the main weaknesses of our system in Chile to face the future installation deployment of energy devices in our coastline. What can we learn from other maritime industries? What I think could be the main threats to marine energy project to be conducted in Chile at this point. I hope to tell you briefly about my thoughts, at least, what are the main strengths of the Chilean social ecosystems to face projects on energy production, and also try to highlight some of the gaps that I think we need to work forward and rapidly to fill those gaps before we are prepared to face a sustainable project on marine energies. And finally, I guess I'll give you some ideas of what are potentially the most different aspects of the Chilean coastal ecosystem in terms of what we know from mostly in the Northern Hemisphere regarding impacts of energy devices. So like I said, there are basically no commercial marine or offshore energy projects that have been deployed in Chile, very little research. So we do not have any information about studies being conducted in Chile with our coastal fauna and flora. So the question is, what can we learn from other maritime, marine, offshore industries in the country? And my answer is very brief, actually very little. And I'm going to try to give you a quick review of what I see has been done with some of the major industries in the country. First, the salmon aquaculture industry, probably the most intense industry in coastal waters in Chile for the past 20 years. But probably that industry is one of the worst examples of environmental impact assessment in the entire world. The industry has been preoccupied only recently with actually monitoring their potential impacts, but that is mostly restricted to water quality. There is virtually no assessment of the impacts of the anchoring systems, the plastic garbage, the impacts of mammal communities besides visualizing mammals as a threat to the productive process. No impacts on the escaped salmon has been assessed by the industry. So there isn't that much that we can learn from that particular industry, and the characteristics of the industry are quite different to the type of environments where we visualize energy production will take place in the country. In terms of offshore gas and oil, we do have a small production of offshore gas in Magallanes. But as you probably know, there is virtually no environmental impact that has been conducted or that is publicly available, at least. These were installations conducted many years ago before the environmental assessment system was in place in Chile. Dredging and sediment disposal, this is an activity that is actually increasing in the country in all major ports. They do require an environmental impact report assessment. However, the normative really precludes any realistic assessment of the true impacts of that system. And that is, like I'll say in a minute, one of the main weaknesses of the Chilean system. Submarine emissaries, all central Chile and pretty much the entire country has emissaries for sewage disposal in the ocean. Unfortunately, there is, as far as I know, no assessment of the impacts of the pipes into the ocean on the sediment and benthic habitats. And the concern has been so far only with water pollution, which is good and generally a good system for keeping track of the potential impacts, but not that useful for the energy projects. So most of the studies in Chile have focused on contamination, such as oil spill or sewage treatment or local chemical pollution. And unfortunately, that type of information is quite different to the impacts that Andrea was summarizing that could have energy devices in the ocean. Fortunately, the existence of the OES Environmental 2020 State of Science report is a fantastic resource for future environmental research in Chile. And I believe it sets those guidelines that are needed not only to cite a potential project, but to guide research on environmental impacts in Chile. In terms of what I think are the main threats to research, to an energy project in Chile, I think that the main threat is actually a very weak legislation and virtually a complete absence of useful normative for the maritime industry in general, or marine industry, including the energy industry or future energy industry. So it is extremely important that, to me, that the marine renewable industry internalizes that it's not only a matter of renewable energy, but a matter of actually sustainable production of energy. And by that, I mean sustainable in terms of environment and social systems in the country. So we must fulfill that promise of zero biodiversity impact. And I believe completely that that is the actual market of marine renewable energies, the most environmentally friendly production of energy, of all renewable energies. Opportunities and strength in Chile, I think that we do have many opportunities and several strengths to conduct an energy project in a successful manner in terms of the minimizing any of the environmental impacts. And to me, that report that I just mentioned that Andrea explained, and I haven't read it in detail, but it summarizes I think all or most of the existing information we have and establishes very clear guidelines of which are the main potential threats of the different types of devices that we might require to deploy at sea to produce energy. And I think that that is a great resource, like I said, for Chile to get started and get ahead, building on many, many years of research conducted in the Northern Hemisphere. I think it's also very important that for foreigners present in the audience to know that Chile has a very good, comparatively very good to excellent knowledge on coastal ecosystems. And that is not the same situation in most of South America and many places in the world. We have a very strong and long tradition of researching coastal ecology and coastal ecosystems in general, with good knowledge on biodiversity, fairly good knowledge on the main biotic and abiotic forcing in these systems, and also good understanding of socio-ecological systems. And also, probably a little bit more recent, but still in the past 20, 25 years, there has been a tremendous increase in the knowledge that we have about coastal oceanography. And there is a large community of outstanding oceanographers distributed along the country. And I think we have a very good understanding also of coastal processes, the main scales of variability and general variability in the hydrography of all coastal ecosystems in Chile, including the open coast and interior waters. And also, I think a very important strength associated to the previous two is that we have the capacity to train at a very high level young students in science. So we're in a good position to train students and face projects on energy production in the country. And I think we are in a unique position from that point of view, and not only because we have very good resources to be exploited. In terms of what I think are major gaps in our system in Chile, like I said, besides a very weak legislation in normative, I think that we have a very weak to inexistent in situ monitoring programs. We do not have good monitoring of local variables. And just so you So you know, the satellite information that is so tremendously useful for oceanographic studies is of rather limited use when it comes to assessing the environmental impact at a given site or even in general for coastal conditions. Government-sponsored biodiversity programs for monitoring are almost non-existent besides harmful algal blooms, mussel watch, and very few other programs. And shore system for tidal gauges and wave buoys are still far too scarce to provide any good information on in situ variability at high frequency and sufficient spatial coverage. Therefore, the university-sponsored oceanographic buoys, there is only 4 of them deployed in the country, are very critically important to assess environmental impact. And even though this seems to be a commercial for the Merrick Group, but it's actually very important, we are deploying the Open Sea Lab, and it's going to become one of the most complete coastal observing systems in South America. And that is also not only important for the assessment of energy devices, but also for potentially understanding variables and frequencies and high enough that would allow a better understanding of impacts of energy devices. There is also lack of expertise in specific areas, I think, in the country. And one of them, like in other parts of the world, is that we have a very large community of mammal conservationists, but not that many scientists. And like Andrea mentioned, the mammals are a major concern when deploying things with moving parts and that make noise out in the ocean. And so we need to probably increase that community. And the other one that is quite important, and I think that we do not have research teams working on sound in general, on the potential problem of noise. Most oceanographers are not trained in underwater sound measurements or modeling. So that's an area that I think we should make concerted efforts to improve in the training of our future scientists. There is in general good consulting companies for marine habitats, but still I would say they are not very sophisticated. For instance, there are very few PhD trained people in those consulting firms, and weak legislation, I think, does not create the incentives to improve the capacities of consulting companies in Chile. The final point that I want to make, I think that I'm running out of time already, is what could make Chilean ecosystems substantially different from the systems that have been studied in more detail in the Northern Hemisphere and that inspire most of the studies on environmental impact. Well, first of all, of course, you know, the local fauna and local flora will always modulate the responses of these stressors in the actual natural ecosystems. And they are always a source of surprises when anticipating environmental impact of any project out at sea. So local characteristics, attributes of that fauna and flora will alter to some extent what we know from other systems. The other characteristic or attribute that could be important is the comparatively high productivity of coastal waters. I'm not sure it's that much higher than in other places like California, but definitely higher than some of the Northern Hemisphere, Northern Ocean, and even Southern Chile areas. And that could either ameliorate the impacts of observing other systems, or in some cases amplify those impacts in the local community. And that is something to be aware of, that we have large animals that can grow really fast or that can be affected to a much larger extent than in other places. And of course, the extreme conditions of Chilean habitat that has been mentioned before. Weak agencies is related to the lack of normative, and unfortunately having weak agencies is going to make it difficult to anticipate changes. But probably most of all, and with this I finish, is the importance of coastal fisheries in Chilean ecosystems, and the critical importance of fishers' perceptions and well-being for the country. It's not only a large community, but also an economically important community. And that is going to be a point that acquires much larger relevance than in the US or in the Northern Hemisphere. So with that, I think I'm gonna finish there, Andrea, and give you the floor.
Sergio, that was great. That was a wonderful trip through what we can expect in Chile. Okay, well, we had some really good thoughts put forward in my group. I think that particularly the things that were of concern in Chile, we had a wide range of them, both on the environmental side, particularly about things like anti-fouling paints and also cathodes. What kind of contamination could there be of the environment from these uses? The whole idea of concerns about animal migration. If we do desalinate, do we have a good enough handle on what happens to the brine? There was also a lot of interest in how do we think about social acceptance, particularly with fisheries, that this becomes a really big issue. There's also concerns socioeconomic of a slightly different type. Where do the funds come from to do the research and development on the environmental side of marine energy when so much usually goes to engineering? How do we ensure that the environmental work is done? Also pointed out to us that although the floating offshore wind platforms should do less damage to the environment than the bottom-based wind, when they are brought to port, there may be some damage done on the site, and many of the ports are simply not in a position to do the work on these enormous structures. So there's a big gap socioeconomically of what needs to be done there. As far as how international research can apply in the Chilean perspective, the context, there was general consensus that having this international work done is really helpful, that especially with no regulatory processes in place, and the fact that Chile does not yet have test centers, but may have, there's many lessons, good and bad, from the international community, what needs to be done at test centers so that we get environmental data along with testing data, and also the ability to really apply common protocols and technologies in testing and environmental work, but recognizing that species assemblages, particularly for the benthic environment, biofouling, are very unique, and that work will in fact need to be done in Chile. Some of it's transferable internationally, but some of it is not. Oh, that's kind of it. Anybody from my group would like to chime in and tell everyone what I missed? Okay, Lisel, you're up.
It's okay.
Hi. So we had some discussion on, so the concern where actually it's not as specific as Chile is a concern, but several concerns that we found in the international community can have can apply here, but mainly, as you say, Andrea, the fisheries, and actually right now some coastal fisheries and artisanal fisheries are already overexploited and need to be regulated. So adding marine renewable energy device in the water, it needs to be like, we need to make sure that there won't be cumulative effects in there. Tourism is very important in Central and North Chile, so there may be like some visual pollution concern, like socioeconomic concern here. And someone mentioned some work has been done in south of Chile with a distribution of marine mammal, with a huge overlap between the energy, the wave energy, I think it was wave energy, and marine mammal distribution. So this is a big concern for Chile. And we talk about more on the Chilean strengths for international collaboration, and there was someone who is from the industry and saying that they are developing wave energy converters. They are like developing several technologies that can be used both in Chile and in the international, and they are very open to collaborate. So I think there will be a lot of contact and connection to be made. Linnea, if you want.
Yes, sorry, it takes me a minute since I'm sharing my screen, so I had to move stuff around and actually leave the full screen to get back to my Jamboard. So in our group, the concerns that were very diverse. There were some interesting concerns that I had never heard before, but that actually makes sense, like large marine flora that could tangle with device, sea kelp, long, several tens of meters long kelps that are not a concern in Northern Europe or not much in the US for now. Another concern was low budget for science. And I think this is not limited to Chile, but it is a very important concern. For sake of time, I will move on to the next. How the international research can apply to Chile. Then one of the most points that we discussed was that it would be really very helpful for Chile that international teams that went through many trials and errors and failed in a lot of places before publishing their successful results actually share what did not work, so Chile doesn't repeat the steps that did not work and actually go straight to what works. And then Chilean strengths for international collaboration. One of the main strengths that we discussed is that a lot of the offshore energy scientists here in Chile are used to collaborating together with multidisciplinary teams, and so they actually know how to talk to each other from very different field of science, and that is very helpful for talking to international colleagues in other fields. And I think, yep, that's all.
That is great. Well, I'd like to thank everybody. I know this was an awfully fast gallop through a workshop. We really do thank you for coming today, sharing your thoughts. I would, encourage you to reach out to us if you have interests. Check out the State of the Science report, which you've now seen the cover of about 12 times in our slides. We really do look forward to the opportunity to collaborate with colleagues on any of these topics we've talked about. So I'd really just like to thank Sergio, Lisel, Linnea, Natalie, Marco for helping here today. Thank Merrick for hosting us, and thank all of you for your engagement. I think we have to move back to the conference.
Yes, we really appreciate all support that you have given us. And now we are going to move again to the main website of the conference we have the last session of last round thesis. And again, thank you, Andrea, Liza, Linnea, and Sergio. All was great. Thank you very much. A lot of short, but very intense and very productive. A lot of ideas. For sure, we are going to keep working on that. Thanks a lot.